I think I got it going. All right. Okay, verse 4. The other was Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Machlon and Chilion died also, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord," which in Hebrew is Yahweh, "deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord, or Yahweh, grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord, or Yahweh, has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord, or Yahweh, do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but Yahweh has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when Yahweh has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So it tells us that this story takes place during the time of the Judges. And I don't know how familiar you are with the book of Judges, but it tells about different leaders who were called judges. Now, that's a little misleading because they weren't normally judging cases, but they were warriors. They led the people in battle. So the pattern in the book of Judges is that they would sin, Israel would be punished, then God would raise up an enemy to oppress them, and then they would pray and repent, and God would raise up a judge to deliver them, and they would go on that way. Well, so it was a very lawless period. The Israelites kept going astray and worshiping other gods. And it even says, the very last verse of the book says this, Judges 21:25, "In those days there was no king in Israel, All the people did what was right in their own eyes. Everybody did what they felt like doing. Whatever was right in their own eyes. Can you imagine if we drove like that? Just drive on the road however you feel like it. You can yield or stop or go fast or go through red lights. It doesn't, you just do what you want.
They're out there.
What's that?
They're out there.
Yeah, there are people like that. There was the story, the guy, the wife called him up and said, I'm just warning you, I've heard on the radio that somebody's driving the wrong way on the freeway. He said, no, there are hundreds of them. So it's a lawless period, and some people think the book is placed here to balance out the view of that period a little bit with this beautiful little story. I mean, it's a sad story, but it's a beautiful little story. It's not a story of lawlessness. It's a story of peace and love and loyalty and Ruth who converts and worships the true God and so on. So some people think that it's put here to kind of balance out the negativity that goes on in the book of Judges. And I don't know if you remember, but the book of Judges is not just about judges, but at the end of the book it tells about the story of the Levite and the concubine, and she's raped and murdered, and it's this, and then they go to civil war, and it's a very tragic, sad story. So anyway, Ruth balances that out a little bit. And also, as we'll see next week, it doesn't come up in this week's passage, but when we look at it next week, we'll see that this story also is very important for laying the foundations for King David and his reign, because Ruth is one of the ancestors, or ancestresses, if you will, of David. And so it's telling about the background of David, and so it's interesting that, this great king has a Moabite in his ancestry. And then, of course, David is the type of Messiah who is to come, and David's dynasty and his lineage lead down to Jesus the Messiah. And so Jesus' lineage is given in 2 of the Gospels. We have his genealogy, and one of them does, I think just one of them mentions Ruth, and she's a foreigner, she's a Moabite, but she is part of the genealogy of Jesus. It tells us there was a famine in the land. So it was not uncommon for people to migrate when food was scarce. They would migrate to a place where there was more food. And of course, this is not just in the time of ancient Judah, but it's still true today. People will sometimes move if the place they're at is not sufficient to supply them with food. And then sometimes in times of war and other factors lead to people migrating and leaving a troubled area. And then they become refugees, and it depends on the time and the country to which they go and how they're treated and so on. But what this family decided to do was go into Moab, where they had more food. You may recall Abraham. That happened to Abraham. At one point, food was scarce. There was a famine in the land of the Promised Land, the land of Canaan. And Abraham and Sarah went down to Egypt for food. And that was one of the stories. Abraham did this twice, but once he did it at Gerar. But in Egypt, he passed off his wife as his sister and said, oh, this is my sister. Because he's afraid that Pharaoh will take her and kill Abraham and take her as his wife. But Abraham and Sarah went down to Egypt for food. So they went into a foreign land, and Ruth is like that. Naomi and Elimelech are like that, and then they meet Ruth in the land of Moab. She's a Moabite. Similarly, Jacob and his sons had to go down to Egypt in the time of famine. And, of course, what they didn't know is that Joseph was head over Egypt now, except for Pharaoh, and was in charge of rationing out the food that they'd stored up during the abundant years. And they had to be confronted by this brother that they had sold into slavery. And of course, he was gracious and merciful on them. But they went down to Egypt also for food. But in this case, this family is going into Moab, not Egypt. But they're going because of the scarcity of food. The name of the man was Elimelech. In Hebrew it's pronounced Eli Melech. El, you may recognize, it means God. Eli means my God, and Melech means king. So my God is king. In this time they had no earthly king in Israel, and God was thought to be king. They had a theocracy. And even later when they established kings, God was still thought to be the main king, and then the earthly king was there just to kind of carry out Yahweh or the heavenly king's plans. He was the earthly king was sort of a vice-regent. But that was his name, Elimelech. My God is king. We're told that they were Ephrathites. So Bethlehem is in the tribal territory of Judah, and the tribes are named after the sons of Jacob. And Judah was one of his sons. And so we have the tribal territory of Judah, which was in the south. It was a large territory. And then you had subgroupings or clans. And one of the clans was Ephratah. And Bethlehem is part of that grouping. And as they went into Moab, which is a neighboring country, it's across the Jordan River from Judah. You cross over the Jordan River, and you're in the land of Moab. And I want you to see that this notion of migration frames the book. And so at the beginning, they leave Judah because there's a scarcity of food in Judah. And then when Naomi and Ruth come back, it's because they've heard that there's food again in Judah. So they're moving back and forth because of the food, and it frames this story going down and coming back. And another thing frames this account, and that is the leaving of one's people. So Elimelech and his family left their people in Judah and Bethlehem in order to go to Moab. And then when Ruth comes back with Naomi, she forsakes her people and her gods in order to become one with the Israelites and the Jews, or the Judeans. The Moabites were a Semitic people. They're distantly related to the Israelites. You may recall back in the book of Genesis about Lot. So Lot had gone into the land of Sodom, and he'd been sort of corrupted by those people. But when God decided to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot was allowed to leave, and his wife went with him and his two daughters. And then there's this story of how Lot had children through his daughters. It's incest, but I won't go into all the details. But the two sons were one of them was the father of the Moabites, and the other is the father of the Ammonites. So Lot was Abraham's nephew, and the Moabites are descended from him. So they're distantly related, but then they become the two nations of Israel and Moab. And at times there was war between the two. There was hostility between Israel and Moab, or between Judah and Moab. So that's something to keep in mind. The Moabites were polytheists. That means they worshipped more than one god. One of their chief gods was Chemosh, and he's mentioned in the Bible. And he's also mentioned in a famous ancient Near Eastern text called the Moabite Stela, or the Moabite Stone, which was found in Jordan and is now in the Louvre Museum in Paris. But you can read about one war with the Moabites in one battle that took place in 2 Kings chapter 3. We won't take time to turn to it and look at it, but you can read about it there. And the Moabites had a similar theology about their god Chemosh, that he would bless them if they did right, and he would curse them if they did wrong, and he would... They had this belief in putting all things to death at certain times. Remember that at Jericho they were told not to keep any spoil, but everything must be destroyed, and it's called cherem. But in this Moabite text that we've found, that term is used there also, where at times they would fight and put everything to death. So there were similarities. Chemosh was a fertility god. But anyway, it was considered off limits to the Jews. They were only supposed to, and the Israelites, they were only supposed to worship Yahweh, the one true God of Israel. Sadly, Elimelech died. And so poor Naomi lost her husband. But her sons survived for a time, and they grew up to the point where they were at least able to marry, and they chose Moabite women for their wives, one of which was Ruth. But then, sadly, it tells us in verses 6 and 7 that, actually it's earlier than that, it's in verses 4 and following. So in verse 4 it tells us that they married and were alive for 10 years, but then in verse 5, the two sons also died. And so now Naomi is left without her husband, without her sons. She just has these two Moabite daughter-in-laws. So Naomi hears that food is available again in Judah, and she decides to go back. And at first, the daughters-in-law go with her. But then Naomi tries to talk them out of that. And she says, your prospects are not going to be very good if you come with me to Judah. Yeah, there's food there again, but there's food here. And you're going to be foreigners in the land of Judah. You might not be treated well. It's not here in the Bible, but I mean, I'm kind of reading between the lines. That may be why she tries to talk them into staying. She says, she's probably encouraged them to get married here to a Moabite man, and they're young enough that they can have another chance. They can have children, and they had no children with their Judean husbands. Okay, so at this point, Naomi doesn't have any grandchildren. She's just got these daughters-in-law. So these women are young enough that they could remarry and have children, and they could have maybe a good life if they stay in their homeland, and they can be with their families. And so, she tries to talk them into this. And she blesses them. In verse 8, may the Lord deal kindly with you. Here we have this word chesed again, which I've taught you before. It means loving kindness. It's in the Psalms when it says, thy loving kindness is better than life. It's chesed. That's God's loving kindness. Or it's sometimes translated mercy. In that psalm that says, his mercy endureth forever, the term mercy there is chesed. His mercy, his chesed, his loving kindness, his mercy, his covenant love, his faithfulness. It can be rendered loyalty, kindness, goodness. The daughters-in-law have shown that to Naomi and to the dead, she says, to their husbands that have now been deceased. And so Naomi is blessing them for that and complimenting them for that. It's a very high compliment. But she now blesses them and extends the hope that God will show chesed or kindness to them as these daughters-in-law have shown it to their husbands and to Naomi. And in verse 9, she continues to bless them, expressing the hope that they will find security through marrying again, presumably to fellow Moabites at this time. Well, at first, the two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, say they will go with Naomi, but Naomi continues to try to dissuade them and persuade them to stay. Stay in Moab. Stay in your own country. And now she brings up this custom, it's an Israelite custom, of the levirate marriage. You may have heard of this. It's not related to the term Levi, some people think that, but it's related to the term levir, which means brother-in-law. And the idea is this, that when a man dies, and he leaves his wife, he's been married, but he dies, the man's brother is supposed to marry this woman and raise up children. And when he does, those children are not his, I mean, they are his, biologically, but they are to be raised up as the children of the one who died. And then they are thought of as legally his children, and so they inherit his goods and his lands, if he has any, and so on. So she alludes to this, Naomi does. And she puts out a hypothetical. She says, suppose I were to get married right now and immediately have children. Well, you'd still have to wait for them to get old enough to be able to marry you. Are you going to wait around that long? And of course, that's impossible. She can't immediately get married and immediately have children. So, I mean, it's hypothetical, but the point is, don't wait that long. Don't, we're not going to do this. Go marry a Moabite. Stay here, stay home. Be with your families. You'll be fine. And I mentioned this elaborate marriage because it's going to come up later in the story. And you know the story maybe about Boaz and so on. We'll get to that. But she says, look, it's been far more bitter for me than you. The point is that it's been bitter for them because they lost their husbands. But they're young enough that they can start over. Naomi feels she's too old to marry again. And certainly she feels she's too old to have children. Maybe she's past the childbearing age. We don't know exactly how old she is. Maybe she's young enough but just feels she's not up to it. But in any case, she says, it's been really bitter for me. I've lost my husband and my sons. But you could start over. You could have a new life. Stay here. Verse 14, then they wept aloud again. If you look at the commentaries, they debate about who the they refers to. Is it just the daughters-in-law? Because it says, Naomi speaks to her daughters-in-law and they wept aloud. Is that just the daughters-in-law, or is it all three of them? I think it's all three. I think that it was an emotional moment. It was a moment of bonding as they all wept over their losses and had this time together. And it's a poignant, touching moment. But it leads to a choice for the two daughters-in-law, and they each do different things. Orpah kisses her mother-in-law goodbye and leaves and stays there in Moab. But Ruth clings to her mother-in-law and refuses to leave her. Naomi made one last attempt. Verse 15. See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. And that leads to the most familiar words in the book. You've probably heard these words before. They are sometimes used at weddings. But they are, I heard them. I don't know. They've been set to music. I thought about bringing one example of that. Maybe I'll do it next week. But anyway, here you have the words of Ruth. Do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Notice this is a conversion experience. Not only does Ruth promise to give up her people and to stay with Naomi, but she is going to give up her gods and worship the one true God of Israel. Your God will be my God. She's going to worship Yahweh from now on. Where you die, I will die, there I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more also, more as well, even if death parts me from you. This last part is hard to translate. Some say, if anything but death separates, because death might separate us. But maybe she means I'll be buried with you so I won't be separated even in death. But the other thing is, the point is, nothing else can separate me from you. I'm not going to leave you. As long as you're still alive, I'm staying with you. And this is a curse formula. It's an oath formula. And you may be familiar with it in other places. David uses it. Other people use it in the Bible. May the Lord do so to me. And also Saul uses it at one point. But the idea is this. I'm vowing, I'm promising, I'm making an oath that I will stay with you. And if I fail to keep it, may I be destroyed. That's basically what she's saying. May Yahweh, may God do the same to me and more, is a euphemism for may God destroy me. Pretty serious stuff, right? She really means it. I want you to know, Naomi, I'm not leaving you. I'm sticking with you. So what a tremendous witness of loyalty we have here in Ruth. When Naomi saw that she was determined, she let her alone and stopped trying to persuade her. And so they went on to Bethlehem. And when they got there, the people saw them and they remembered Naomi, even though it had been 10 years. And they called her Naomi, which means pleasantness or sweetness. And she says, don't call me pleasantness anymore. Call me Mara, which means bitterness. Don't call me pleasantness. Call me bitterness. Because Yahweh has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty. The word for Almighty there in verse 20 is Shaddai. You may be familiar with the different El names in Genesis. El Shaddai is one of them. And Amy Grant made a popular song out of this. How many of you have heard that song? Anybody? El Shaddai, El Shaddai. All right, well, never mind. Anyway, Shaddai probably doesn't mean might or power or almighty. It has to do with mountain. El, the one of the mountains. Shaddai probably is related to the Akkadian word, the Babylonian word, Shadu, meaning mountain. We won't go into the grammar and languages any more than that, linguistics. But it is another word for God. So Shaddai and Yahweh are used here. But it makes a play on Naomi's word, her name. It means pleasantness. Now she wants to be known as bitterness. Notice her theology is similar to Job. I said we'd finished with Job, but in a way we haven't, because we're back now in the same kind of situation where somebody has suffered terribly, like Job. And she believes that God has done this to her. The Almighty has dealt harshly with me. Yahweh has dealt harshly with me. The Almighty, Shaddai, has brought calamity upon me. And we talked about this last week. And what we said was that God allows, that's our theology. We don't say God causes it. And in the prologue to Job, we do see that God did allow Satan to do the things, but Satan did them directly. But we say God allows. So she says God has dealt harshly with me. Naomi reminds us of Abraham. Abraham also left his homeland and people to go to the land that God would show him. But there's a big difference. God spoke to Abraham and says, I want you to leave your people, go to the land I will show you. He brought him to Canaan, and that became the promised land. But Elimelech and his family left not because God told them to, but because of famine. And in fact, they're leaving the promised land to go into a foreign territory. And then Naomi also reminds us of Job, as I already mentioned. So we just spent 3 Sundays talking about Job and his sufferings. And he lost his children, his wealth, and his health. And here Naomi is left without her husband and children. And she suffers also a terrible loss. And this would have led to her great poverty. In this day, women didn't do well on their own. They didn't normally work outside the home, and they would normally be under the protection and provision of some man, whether her father or her husband or her sons. If her husband died and her son survived, they would have taken care of her, but they're dead too. And she is in a very vulnerable, marginalized position now in the ancient Near Eastern culture. In Ruth, God is involved in this book. The book of Ruth. God is involved, but he's more in the background. He's mentioned, but he doesn't come to the forefront. He doesn't speak. He doesn't act in a way that's obvious. He doesn't do miracles, but he is there. He provides for them as they go into Moab to find food. He provides for them as they come back, and as we'll see, God provides for Ruth and Naomi when they get back to this land of Bethlehem. We'll get to that next week. And he provides a king for Israel, a good King David. David, of course, had his sins and his problems, but he was thought of as an ideal king, and he was good in many ways. And then this provides a dynasty also that leads up to the coming of Messiah. And we're almost to the time of Advent and the birth of Jesus. It's hard to believe, but we're almost at Advent and Christmas time. Not that far off. You may have heard of Richard Harris. He played King Arthur in the movie Camelot. Did you see that? Remember this? It's a great movie. I love the opening where he's out in the forest and he's scared because they're bringing the woman that he's going to marry, and I don't think they've met yet. And anyway, I wonder what the king is doing tonight. And what what is the king? He's scared. He's scared. That's what anyway, he's afraid of this marriage coming out of it. Anyway, it's a great opening scene. All right, so he also played Professor Dumbledore in some of the Harry Potter movies. I think the original one died, and then he played him after that. He died in 2002. He was 72. Harris often brought a brooding quality to his characters, which may have been a reflection of his real-life character. He had a reputation as a bar fighter, raconteur, that's a storyteller, and a rascal. The Harry Potter filmmakers asked Harris to sign on to film all 7 episodes, which he did reluctantly. He commented, "I hate that kind of commitment. I hate the idea that my life in any way is sort of restricted. That's why my marriages broke up. I hate commitment, and I'm totally unreliable anyway." He said that of himself. Ruth was the opposite. She could make a commitment and stick to it. She was loyal to her mother-in-law. I didn't know this before, but I read this in preparation for this sermon about Jacqueline Kennedy, the wife of John F. Kennedy. When the Cuban Missile Crisis took place, and we came very close to nuclear war, she begged her husband not to send her away. This is from the New York Times, by the way. Quote, "If anything happens, we're all going to stay right here with you. I would rather be here and die with you, and our children too, than to live without you." Isn't that sweet? Loyalty to her husband. I'll tell you one more story of loyalty. I'll see if I can get through this. And you may know about this. Some of you animal lovers may know about it already. So, in the book titled Known, Dick and Ruth Foth tell a poignant story of devotion and loyalty. This takes place in Edinburgh, Scotland. Edinburgh is famous for the story of a dog and his owner that expressed devotion and tenacity in equal measure. The story began in 1850 when John Gray came to the city to be a gardener. Unable to find work, he joined the police force as a night watchman. To keep him company through the long nights, he would take his small Skye Terrier named Bobby with him on his rounds. They became part of the living landscape of the city night after night for years. John later contracted tuberculosis and died in the winter of 1858. He was buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard, or churchyard. What happened next became legend in the city. Bobby, the Skye Terrier, would not leave the master's grave. Except for midday meals that he took from the kind people in the area, Bobby stayed there day and night with his master. The caretaker tried on many occasions to evict the dog, but to no avail. Finally, he provided the little dog with a shelter by the grave. When the city passed an ordinance that all unlicensed dogs would be destroyed, the Lord Provost of Edinburgh, William Chambers, purchased the license